The fire didn't just consume wood, shingles, and paint. It swallowed memories, photographs, the smell of Sunday dinners, the rhythm of a house built by hands that carried more scars than most men lived to see. And in its orange rage, it devoured a man's dignity, or so the woman with the thin smile and cruel eyes believed. She stood in the shadows at the end of the cul-de-sac, clutching a lighter in her fist like some kind of twisted victory trophy. The glow of the flames reflected in her pupils. She didn't know then that she was setting herself alight, that every flicker of fire would one day become a spotlight above her head. Malcolm Carter stood barefoot on the lawn, helpless, his chest heaving as he held his crying daughter in one arm and his wife by the hand with the other. Every neighbor emerged, some with phones in hand, some whispering, some just staring. None stepped forward to help. The HOA president, the same woman who had written him letters about the unsightly basketball hoop, who called his backyard barbecue too noisy, who once told him to repaint his shutters because they didn't fit the aesthetic uniformity, she was there too. Karen Whitmore. Her pearls rested meekly on her neck, as if even fire couldn't stain her elegance. Malcolm had fought too many battles in life already. Courtrooms where his voice was dismissed because of the color of his skin. Streets where a badge stared him down as if he were prey. Jobs where his resume became invisible the moment his photograph was seen. But this, the sight of his little girl clutching a scorched teddy bear, coughing from the smoke that still clung to the air, this cut deeper than any of it. The police came. Clipboards, flashlights, empty sympathy. "We'll investigate." But Malcolm could see it already, in their posture, in the way they avoided looking too long at Karen, who hovered nearby pretending to console other neighbors. They weren't going to find justice. Not unless he brought it to them. "Daddy, where will we sleep?" His daughter's voice was thin, tired, almost afraid to ask. He looked at her with eyes burning hotter than the wreckage behind him. "We'll be fine, baby," he whispered. "We'll be better than fine." Because in Malcolm's heart, something ancient stirred, a flame much colder than the one that had just consumed his house. In the days that followed, Karen's mask of innocence never cracked. At the HOA meeting, she sighed dramatically about the tragedy on Oakwood Drive and insisted the board should consider whether Malcolm's cluttered yard might have contributed to safety hazards. She spoke of community insurance costs, not of the family who now slept in a relative's cramped guest room. Every word was a dagger disguised as policy. Malcolm sat in the back of that room, silent, his broad shoulders hunched forward. He could feel every whisper around him, the unspoken suspicion that perhaps he hadn't maintained things properly. But what no one there knew, not Karen, not the whisperers, not even his wife, was that Malcolm Carter wasn't just a man who had once studied law. He wasn't just another black homeowner who dared to move into a neighborhood that hadn't wanted him. He was a man who had clawed his way through law school, who had fought cases others thought unwinnable, who had sat across from judges who underestimated him, and who had won enough of those battles that when the opportunity came, he took it. Malcolm Carter was now Judge Carter. And in less than a week, by some bitter stroke of fate, the very woman who burned his life to ash would walk, smug and unsuspecting, into his courtroom. The irony felt biblical. On the 7th day after the fire, Malcolm put on his robe in chambers. The fabric draped heavy across his shoulders, a mantle of authority that never felt like armor until now. He glanced at the docket. There it was, State versus Whitmore. Not arson, not yet. The system was slow, blind in the worst ways. This was a different matter, one that would put Karen in front of him for charges tied to HOA financial misconduct. She had stolen from the very neighbors she pretended to protect. Malcolm steadied his breath. He was not just a man seeking revenge. He was a judge, bound by law. But the law in his hands could cut sharper than vengeance if wielded properly. When the bailiff called and Karen Whitmore strutted in with her lawyer, pearls gleaming, smile polite but smug, Malcolm's eyes met hers. For the first time, her step faltered, not because she knew what he knew, but because she never imagined the man whose house she burned, the man she tried to erase, would be seated above her, gavel in hand.
The courtroom buzzed as though the walls themselves knew history was tilting. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice steady, deep, resonant. This court is now in session. And though no one else knew it yet, a fire greater than the one on Oakwood Drive had just been lit. The silence that fell over the courtroom was different from the silence of that night when Malcolm's house burned. That silence had been heavy with smoke, disbelief, and the cowardice of neighbors who watched but did not act. This silence was sharper, edged with anticipation, every cough muffled, every shuffle of papers sounding too loud. Karen sat at the defense table, her attorney whispering something in her ear, but her eyes, those proud, ice-colored eyes, were fixed on Malcolm. For a moment her mask twitched. Recognition had struck her. She knew now. The man she had mocked, undermined, reported to the HOA board, and ultimately destroyed in flame, was the one presiding over her case. A murmur rippled across the rows of observers, but Malcolm did not flinch. He held her gaze with the calm authority of a man who had waited his entire life for this very intersection of fate. "Mrs. Whittemore," he said evenly, his baritone rolling through the chamber, "you stand before this court accused of embezzling HOA funds for personal use, falsifying financial records, and misappropriating community assets. How do you plead?" Her lawyer jumped in, quick as a viper. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Karen forced a smile, as if to assure herself she still had the upper hand. But Malcolm knew her type. He had seen her reflected in countless other faces in courtrooms. Faces that smirked when they thought the system would bend in their favor. What she did not realize yet was that this particular courtroom belonged to a man who had nothing left to lose. The prosecution began with spreadsheets, receipts, neighbors testifying how Karen had insisted dues had to be raised while her personal bank account swelled. She sat there, pristine in her pressed suit, her lips tightening only slightly when numbers piled against her. But the most powerful evidence wasn't just financial. It was the testimony of those she had hurt, not just with theft, but with arrogance. People who had been fined for trivial violations, who had been humiliated by her at board meetings, who had seen her cruelty disguised as regulation. The cracks in her mask deepened with each voice that rose against her. Malcolm did not intervene more than necessary. A judge's role was not vengeance. It was to ensure fairness, justice, and truth. But fairness itself was often vengeance in disguise when the guilty finally faced it. And Malcolm was meticulous. Every objection he weighed with precision. Every witness he listened to with the patience of a man whose own life had been reduced to cinders by the arrogance now sitting before him. But beneath his calm exterior, the memory of the fire seared. He remembered his daughter coughing into his chest, his wife clutching his arm with quiet terror. He remembered the sound of wood collapsing, of flames roaring as if they had voices mocking him. He remembered, too, the figure in the shadows with a lighter in her hand. That memory never dimmed, no matter how much he tried to bury it beneath the black robe. And so when Karen finally took the stand, it was more than procedure. It was confrontation. Her lawyer advised against it, but Karen's pride refused silence. She straightened, adjusted her pearls, and faced the room as though she was still president of the HOA and everyone else merely guests in her dominion. "I have served this community for years," she began, her voice honeyed with false virtue. "Every decision I made was for the benefit of Oakwood Estates.
These accusations are nothing but resentment from people who do not appreciate the work it takes to maintain standards." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, though his face remained unreadable. "And the funds diverted into your private account?" the prosecutor pressed. "Bookkeeping error, handled by my assistant, not myself. I've already pledged to reimburse the community if any mistake was made." Lies layered upon lies. He could see them stacking like tinder. The jury could see it too. The sideways glances, the stiffened posture of jurors who had grown up in neighborhoods where people like Karen wore masks of civility while wielding power like whips.
Finally, the prosecutor asked, "And what about your comments to Mr. Carter in the weeks leading up to the fire, suggesting his property was unsightly, that his family didn't fit the aesthetic uniformity?" For the first time, Karen's composure faltered. I'd never said anything of that nature." But Malcolm's memory replayed the exact phrasing, her exact tone. He couldn't testify, couldn't step into the role of witness, but he didn't have to. Her arrogance was betraying her in real time. When court adjourned for the day, Malcolm lingered on the bench after the jurors filed out, after Karen swept past him with stiff shoulders, after the spectators trickled away murmuring about hypocrisy and fraud. Alone in the chamber, he pressed his hands against the desk and lowered his head. He had spent a lifetime believing in law as the only weapon sharp enough to carve justice out of injustice. But tonight, as the smell of old ash seemed to rise from his robe, he wondered if even law could heal what had been done. The trial dragged on for days. Each new piece of evidence tightened the rope around Karen's lies. Malcolm watched, never tipping his hand, letting the system do its slow but steady work. And then came the day of closing arguments. Karen's lawyer painted her as a woman overwhelmed, a victim of clerical mistakes, scapegoated by angry neighbors. But the prosecution, with calm precision, laid out every number, every falsified document, every piece of testimony, like bricks in a wall no one could climb. Then it was Malcolm's turn. Judges didn't deliver arguments, but he delivered instruction to the jury. And in those instructions, his voice carried not just the weight of law, but the weight of lived truth. "You are to decide this case not on sympathy, not on prejudice, not on speculation. You are to decide based on evidence. If you find that the evidence proves the defendant used her position for personal gain, then the verdict must reflect that truth. This community entrusted her with power. With that power comes responsibility. Abuse of that responsibility erodes trust, undermines fairness, and harms every person bound by it. Injustice at any level, be it in a courtroom or in a neighborhood, corrupts the very foundation we all depend on." Every word was deliberate. Every word was a blade honed against the stone of his own suffering. And though he never spoke her name with venom, Karen shifted in her seat, as though she felt the flames of her own deeds licking at her heels. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The gasp that rolled through the courtroom was almost satisfying enough to drown out Malcolm's memories. Almost. Karen's lawyer sputtered promises of appeals. Karen herself stood rigid, her pearls trembling against her throat. For the first time, her face cracked, rage, disbelief, fear spilling through the fractures. And Malcolm, looking down at her from the bench, saw not the woman who had once smirked outside his burning home, but a small, cornered figure, realizing that fire consumes all,
even those who think themselves untouchable. When sentencing came weeks later, Malcolm did not sit on the bench. Conflict of interest demanded another judge. But he attended quietly, seated in the back, his robe traded for a simple suit. Karen was given years in prison for financial crimes. The arson investigation, slow as justice always was, would follow. And when it did, there would be no pearls, no HOA titles, no neighborhood meetings to shield her. As Karen was led away in cuffs, Malcolm closed his eyes. His daughter's laughter, free of coughs, echoed in his memory. His wife's hand squeezed his, steady and proud. The house was gone, yes. The photographs, the furniture, the trophies, the warmth of familiar walls, gone. But in its place stood something greater. Proof that even when fire tries to silence, truth has its own way of burning brighter. And Malcolm Carter, who had risen from ashes into judgment's chair, knew one thing with certainty. Karen had lit more than his house that night. She had lit her own ruin.